Today is a day of celebration. We're going to have hundreds of tort reform supporters here to acknowledge how far we've really come in the last decade. Leading into the special session of 2004, tort reform was a hot topic in the campaign. It was a mandate to Governor Barbour, and I was very honored to be a member of Governor Barbour's staff that helped facilitate the legislative agenda for tort reform.
We were celebrating 10 years since tort reform was adopted by the Mississippi legislature, and we're not only celebrating the achievement of accomplishing tort reform, but also what's happened with tort reform, how it has reduced medical malpractice premiums, how it's reduced the number of lawsuits against doctors. We had doctors leaving the state in 2002 and 3 and 4. We had students who graduated from the medical school never thought about practicing law in Mississippi. Lawsuit abuse had caused a health care crisis in our state, and this has solved it. And we'll talk today not only about what got passed, but how it worked, and because it has worked very much. But additionally today we're going to talk about some of the risks in front of us. That even though we've had 10 great years of achievement, not only in the medical side, but also for businesses. When I was elected governor more than 10 years ago, every small business in Mississippi was one lawsuit away from bankruptcy. Today, we have gotten rid of lawsuit abuse in our state to a large extent. It's not perfect, but we still have risks. We have people who want to get all this overturned, lawyers who argue in court that tort reform is unconstitutional. So today, celebrate, but also prepare for the future.
Prior to the passage of tort reform, we were the worst in the country, as rated by every agency who does such ratings. But since we've passed tort reform, this measure that we passed 10 years ago has been hailed as the most comprehensive tort reform measure in America, and it's become a model piece of legislation for other states. So I think we're leading the country now in, as far as setting the example for this area.
You look at the tort reform battles of 2004, that really laid the foundation for creating that environment, which encourages those businesses in the private sector to come to Mississippi, invest capital here, and create jobs here. You look at the largest economic development project in North America in 2006, and they chose Mississippi. The largest economic development project in 2007, all over the North America, and they chose Mississippi. Those two things would not have occurred, and all the successes in economic development we've had since then would not have occurred had we not been creating that environment which encourages businesses to come here, and tort reform plays a major role in that to ensure that every business has predictability and understands the judicial system in which they locate.
We're so excited to be here celebrating 10 years since our tort reform movement began. There's no question that our country, as well as our state, is based on the rule of law. And if our citizenry cannot have confidence that a fair and balanced judicial system is in place, that rule of law begins to be tainted. And so the purpose of the tort reform movement was to bring back into balance civil justice into our state that was being abused so horribly.
Before tort reform, our clinic in Kosciuszko was delivering babies for the women there in that area. However, our malpractice insurance for a family physician delivering babies went up to over $100,000 per physician per year, and it just took us out of the business, unfortunately, for our patients there in the central Mississippi area.
And what happened after tort reform?
After tort reform, we still were not delivering babies, but what has happened is that the number of malpractice claims against us has dropped dramatically, and we feel freer to practice medicine as we know it for the good of our patients.
2 years before tort reform, there were probably 3,000 medical malpractice lawsuits in the state that year. That's out of a total of 5,000 doctors. Last year there were 300. So the impact has been dramatic. The impact on premiums for liability insurance has been a reduction probably of 100% or more.
Well, we've seen the incidence of what most of us considered frivolous claims going down dramatically in the last 10 years, just dramatically. We've also seen premiums for liability insurance drop extremely fast, and which we expected. That's exactly what we expected when the tort reform legislation both times was passed.
United States Chamber of Commerce said in 2002 that if you were pregnant in Mississippi, you needed two things: a set of car keys and a tank of gas, because many OBs had again closed the OB part of their practice, and almost all family medicine physicians quit providing OB care. Sadly, many pregnant patients in rural areas and even communities like Kosciuszko had neither of these two things, and there were reported cases where women delivered on the side of the road on their way to Jackson or Starkville where they could still obtain OB care. Two separate motor vehicle accidents in different parts of the state serve as good illustrations of the damage being done to Mississippians due to a lack of specialty medical services in the state. And in these two cases, it's in neurosurgery. The first case is a middle-aged businessman returning home from a business trip to the Mississippi Gulf Coast. He was involved in a single-vehicle automobile accident and sustained a subdural hematoma, which is bleeding on the brain. He was taken to a large hospital on the Gulf Coast, but there was no neurosurgeon there to do a brain-saving emergency procedure to relieve the pressure on his brain. He was transferred to the University of Mississippi Medical Center, but by the time he arrived, he had sustained permanent brain damage. He survived the incident, but he was permanently disabled. The second case involves a young adult who was involved again in another motor vehicle accident in Greenwood. Both local neurosurgeons had closed their practices. One decided to retire, and the other just left the state. This patient was taken to the local hospital and transferred to the University Medical Center, but by the time again he arrived, he had sustained permanent brain damage. He died 1 month later from his injury. Then we get to 2004, and the Mississippi legislature passes and the governor signs the 2004 Tort Reform Act. The climate immediately starts to improve.
Then when I ran for governor in 2003, I thought lawsuit abuse was one of the biggest issues facing our state. I never made a speech that we didn't talk about lawsuit abuse, whether it was to school teachers, whether it was to doctors or business people or college students, because lawsuit abuse was affecting everybody. We had a health care crisis in Mississippi because of lawsuit abuse. I see Dr. Ed Hill sitting here in the second row, who was president of the American Medical Association at the time. I know he remembers vividly 3 years in a row, the Wall Street Journal, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, picked Mississippi as the worst state in the country for lawsuit abuse. Somebody asked me why. I said, because we deserve it, is why. Our system was just wildly out of control. You had places like Jefferson County where there were more plaintiffs in mass tort lawsuits pending in Jefferson County than the population of the county. We had become a magnet for all these mass tort suits, and people found out as the lady who was the only pharmacist in Fayette that you can go broke winning lawsuits. She finally had to close her pharmacy even though she was never found wrong. She never paid a penny in damages, but she got included in every case because that's what gave them jurisdiction in Jefferson County. I can remember vividly when they closed the obstetrics ward at Montford Jones Hospital in Kosciuszko. Now, if you live at Kosciuszko and you can't deliver babies there anymore, your choices are pretty ragged. You can go to Greenwood, or you can go to Starkville, or you can go to Jackson. You got about an hour and 15 minutes from when your wife or daughter-in-law realizes that she's about to have a baby. And a lot of bad things can happen in an hour or an hour and a half when you're in the process of having a baby. I thought that was about the worst thing I ever heard of until I saw what happened in the county next to mine. Over in Sharkey County, the hospital there is jointly run by Sharkey and Issaquah counties. 2003, the counties closed the emergency room. They closed the emergency room in Sharkey-Issaquah Hospital because they couldn't afford to pay the medical liability premium. Now, can you imagine to be in a small rural community, and if your kid gets hurt playing football or on a four-wheeler, or if your wife has a car wreck, there's not even an emergency room? You have to go to Vicksburg or Yazoo City or Greenville to get emergency medical care? Mississippians understood there was a health care crisis. How could they not? They saw their doctors quitting practicing medicine or quitting delivering babies. That there was only one neurosurgeon between Memphis and Jackson who would do emergency neurosurgery, willing to pay what it cost to get liability insurance.
I just left Columbus, Mississippi a short time ago, where the 300th Lakota helicopter rolled offline and went to our war fighters, the United States Army. 300. Now, just the other day we opened Mississippi Tintac, a new tannery, one of the first in the nation, tanneries where we're actually going to be able to make things like boots. And maybe Harley Davidson will let us make some gloves and jackets for them, because that would never have happened prior to this bill. Can you imagine people that are in the business of taking cattle hide and transforming it into the wonderful leather that we use? How many lawsuits could have been filed against that manufacturer? Why, the first person that walked in got a headache would have been on Claiborne County filing a lawsuit. And in those days, you could get a mobile home, a manufactured home, I want to make sure I got that right, and move them into the venue and then take them into that court. I think they had to live there like 6 months or something, Dean, and you could then file a lawsuit, even if they were from somewhere else. I remember when I was state auditor, we were trying to buy a piece of software to do our very first electronic audit, our very first virtual audit, and the software provider would not sell me that piece of software because they did not want their product to be in Mississippi. He said, if I sell you that product, all of a sudden I'm in Mississippi, I can be under your tort laws there, and I'll get sued for selling products in Wisconsin. They'll drag me into a court somewhere in Mississippi, and so I can't sell it to you. That's how bad it was. Now, there are those that thought we were trying to exaggerate, and we're absolutely telling the truth. The medical industry, I've heard Haley talk about this, and so when I was running, I think, at the time for state auditor, I went to Natchez, Mississippi, and talked to the hospital there, and the physician said, we're moving. We're out of here. We're going to move across the river. All I'll have to do is drive across the river in the Mississippi River Bridge there and live here in Adams County where I now live, but I'm not going to practice here anymore. We're going to shut this clinic down if we have to. I mean, that's where it was at. People, and Dr. Easterling knows this better than anybody. I mean, if you had to find someone to deliver your baby, kind of good luck with that. It was really getting to be a challenge. And so we all know, I'm sure you've heard all of that. But what I can tell you is, with the great help of the Chamber of Commerce, they have a wonderful letter I should be reading to you right now, but I know y'all are a little bit behind time. And I try to stay on real time when I'm speaking. Now, there's real time and there's political time. And I'm going to try to keep you on real time today. But without the hard work of everyone involved, with the guys that you see on the stage and Mississippi Economic Council, who always leads in the right direction, without all of the help, everyone pushing together, without those white coats being at the Capitol that day. I remember hearing stories of House members that would come up and say, my physician says he's not going to see me anymore. Well, what should that tell you? Yeah, maybe you ought to vote for this bill. Without all of that struggle, we would not be in the wonderful position that we're in today. And I would not be able to go out to companies all around the world, like Yokohama Tire Company, that looked at 3,000 different locations, 3,000 different locations across the United States, 28 different states. They narrowed it down to 28, they narrowed it down to 16, they narrowed it down to 3, and then they narrowed it down to 1. And they're coming to West Point, Mississippi. But I can assure you, if it were 10 years ago, if our legal climate were the same, they would not be in West Point, Mississippi. They'd be in South Carolina right now, or Alabama. And I like to keep, I hope you've got the scorecard in front of you. I like to keep up with our scorecard, because there's no need in achieving things if you can't tell people what you're doing. If you look right there, we're number 9 in the nation for economic development opportunities. Not number 50, not number 48, number 9 in the nation. We're number 2 for competitive utility costs and permitting speed. Permitting speed is a huge opportunity for us to get people in business and get them started and get that product here. We're number 5 for entrepreneurial success. Our small businessmen and women do a better job here than 45 other states. Those numbers mean something. And those entrepreneurs can take a chance because our legal climate is conducive to their success, and that's exactly what we wanted. Now, it is the right thing for us to remember and to reflect and to talk and do a little bit of bragging. Bragging ain't bad if it's on the right side and if it's true. So we do just a little bit of that because everybody worked hard to be able to get here, everybody in this room and hundreds more. But it could go away in one election. Now, you think about it. All of this success could go away in one election. If we lost the leadership in the House of Representatives in Mississippi, if we lost the leadership in the Mississippi Senate, now, they'd have to get past a veto if I'm governor, but it would be at some point that I would assure you the clock would be turned back. They would say it is time for us to go back. That could happen. Many of you already know that there's a case that still is out there pending before the Mississippi Supreme Court. And so we've got to be ever mindful of that. Now, it seems as if when we solve these big problems, and I'm about done, my 10 minutes is about up, once leadership solves a challenge in this state, and it's any state, it's only a matter of time until people get complacent and they don't worry anymore. They think that box has been checked and we don't have to worry about it. We need to continue to remind people this could go away. This is one of the accomplishments of a lot of people that worked awful hard to do so. And there are still those that are out there that would love to somehow, either through the courts or the legislative process, turn back to those days that stopped us from achieving the success that we so desire. So it is important today to remember that one election cycle could mean all the difference. And that's why we all work hard to continue to remind people that this is more than just something that we did talk about during election year. It needs to be talked about every year to remind us how important it is. The Governor, thank you for your leadership in this effort. Thank all of y'all for being here.
In the aftermath of the 2004 tort reform fight, on that Tort Claims Board, because the state had gone in the business of operating a medical malpractice insurance company. They had gone into the business out of necessity because there were doctors who could not get insurance. It wasn't that it was priced at a level that they couldn't afford. They literally could not get medical malpractice insurance. The state went into the business, and to me, it's an area that you can truly point to in the effect that tort reform had on the operations of state government. Because within 2 years of tort reform passing, now we had gone through month after month of increasing the number of physicians that the state-run Med-Mal plan insured. We insured at the time over 400 physicians across Mississippi. But within 2 years of tort reform passing, we were able to actually sell that Med-Mal insurance business that was operated by the state. We did so with a $14 million profit that was then put back in the general fund of the state to be spent. And so, to me, when you look at the positive effects of tort reform, you really have to look both from a Med-Mal insurance standpoint, but also obviously from an economic development standpoint. I know a large number of speakers have talked today about the impact of economic development. I've said repeatedly over the last 3 years as we travel around Mississippi, the thing that we hear more than anything else is that our #1 priority in Mississippi must be job creation, bringing better and higher paying jobs to our state. There are a number of threats. There are threats both from a political standpoint and from a policy standpoint. Obviously, in the legislative process, we have done some things over the last 10 years that I would argue have increased and enhanced the business climate in our state. Things like workers' comp reform, for instance, is something we did in 2012. It's going to make a huge difference long term. It's just an add-on to the Tort Reform Battle of 04. In addition to that, we also passed the Attorney General Sunshine Act, which the U.S. Chamber of Commerce said was the most comprehensive Sunshine Act in the entire country, so that now taxpayers know what our Attorney General is doing and how and what he's paying lawyers. And it also capped attorney's fees as well. And so we've taken some additional steps. We have other possibilities from a policy standpoint. But we also elect judges in Mississippi, and we also continuously, every 4 years, elect legislators. And we're just one bad election cycle away from there being challenges to the reforms that have already been enacted, not to mention the ones that we may look at in the future. It's an evolving situation, and one that we'll continue to work to ensure that we can make ourselves competitive when competing with other states for economic development.
The opponents of tort reform will say, well, the public didn't get anything out of that. I would say they did. We had gotten down to virtually no neurosurgeons in Mississippi, and we've now repopulated that specialty. Physicians are moving to the state, slower, but coming. And there's actually been a savings to the public. Physician charges over the last 10 years have dropped about 20%.
We need to not be complacent, because liability crises go in cycles, and we're in a down cycle now, and we don't want another up cycle. So you must continue to be very not get complacent and be very aware of what's going on in the liability market.
We need to remain diligent. We need to keep the elected officials in place that support tort reform. I think very few people are aware of how close medicine came to caving in 10 years ago, and we've corrected that in large measure, so we need to continue in the right direction.
Tort reform in Mississippi has enabled us to lower rates for doctors. I'm talking about medical malpractice rates in over 90% in the last 10 years. That's the effect of tort reform. And it hadn't done any damage at all that I can find to any of the consumers in the state. What it has done is limited non-economic damage, things that we don't know about, but it has enabled us to put a cap around the enormous rates that we had for medical malpractice rates. I've seen rates drop from $300,000 for an OBGYN to $27,000 to $28,000. And that to me is important economically for the state of Mississippi. It put us back even with all the other states in the United States.
We need to continue to make sure that we have reasonable health care policies in place, and we need to continue to try to recruit and train physicians to be in this state so that we can improve the health of Mississippians.
I think the thing we need to do going forward is just to be vigilant. We have a good comprehensive law, one of the best in the lands now. Mississippi is #1 in tort reform or tort law, and there are so many that can gain if that was to be diminished in any way. Where that probably will be challenged going forward is not in our legislature, but more likely will be in the judicial system, in the court system. And there's where we need to be vigilant to understand what's transpiring, what in way of election time for judges, who those are those men and women that believe in a fair and balanced system, and what caseloads, what cases are coming through those courts, and be vigilant about what the true impact or the true intent of the case is happening. Is it to defeat some of this tort reform legislation?
It's an important issue for every Mississippian. Every Mississippian pays the cost for a civil justice system that's out of balance. Whether you are personally affected or whether it affects you indirectly, you are interested in tort reform. For example, If you were to have a wreck in 2002 in the Mississippi Delta and you suffered a head injury, you would be at great risk because there was no neurosurgeon available in the Delta during what's called the golden hour to intervene and help stop any permanent damage. And we do know of some examples where individuals were injured and missed that opportunity. And that was a direct result of neurologists not being available because the tort reform climate was so hard on them, they left the state. So whether you were personally involved in the fight for tort reform or whether you just were an average citizen needing access to care, tort reform was important to you.
We have to protect what we've done. There are lawyers who are bringing lawsuits, as I said earlier, claiming that tort reform is unconstitutional, that limits on non-economic damages or punitive damages are unconstitutional. We have to protect the law that was passed. And so we have to make sure we elect people in next year's legislative and state elections who are committed to this, that judges are committed to the laws that the legislature passes. And we also have to realize there are some things that weren't done. For instance, the appeal bond law, if a company has a judgment against them, they have to put up 125% of the judgment. So if you get a small company in a county like Jasper County. In 2012, a small oil drilling company, Eagle Oil, had a case and the jury found against them to the tune of $36 million. Of that $36 million, $26 million was absolutely contrary to the tort reform law. Absolutely. But they couldn't appeal because they couldn't raise the money to buy the bond, which was, as I say, 125%. So they had to raise a $45 million bond to have the right to appeal. So we want to make sure, and we have in the law that passed 10 years ago, there's nobody in Mississippi that loses their right to sue. Everybody has the right to go to court if they were hurt, to recover the damages and then some. But we've also got to make sure that we don't have an appeal bond law that is so expensive that when somebody violates the tort reform law, the defendant can't appeal. So that's one of the things we're talking about going forward too.